Sí, ok, ya está. Hola, muy buenas tardes. Muchas gracias por su presencia. Le damos la bienvenida al doctor Neil Stewart de la Universidad de Edimburgo. Él trabaja en el Instituto de Geografía de esta gran universidad. El año pasado ya tuve la oportunidad de ir a visitarlo y trabajar unos días con él, que aproveché para asistir a un congreso a la Universidad de Oxford y pues bueno, ahí digo, no está cerca, pero pues bueno, lo pasé a ver porque ya tenía muchos años que me estaba invitando para ir a verlo y pues ya era la segunda vez que andaba por allá y no lo iba a visitar. Anil ya tiene 10 años que lo conozco. Por ahí unos amigos de Argentina me mandaron un correo en donde me mandaban la invitación para asistir a un curso en Santiago de Chile de bases de datos espaciales. Ese es raro, un curso de esto. De bases de datos hay muchos, ¿no? Pero de bases de datos espaciales con datos geográficos, pues sí es raro, ¿no? Entonces, pues asistí a este curso y pues bueno, Neil ahí era uno de los profesores junto con Bruce Giddings, que es otro investigador del Instituto de Geografía de la Universidad de Edimburgo. También buen amigo, ahora que estuvimos por allá, anduvimos visitándolo. Y bueno, la oportunidad se presentó y él me comentó que quería participar, que quería tener contacto con nuestra universidad, con la UNAM. Yo le dije que pues también igual estaba bastante interesado. Afortunadamente en aquel entonces la administración, la dirección de ese entonces nos apoyó para que viniera al siguiente año a darnos cursos, conferencias. Y bueno, ya con el paso del tiempo ya se ha hecho regular su visita cada año a dar precisamente estas presentaciones. Pero pues bueno, ya ahora con la figura que tiene en la universidad, también igual como un divulgador, y también contacto para precisamente el ingreso a esta gran universidad, la Universidad de Edimburgo. Hay carreras en el área de geomática. De hecho él es parte de la maestría en geomática, y estuvo también igual y creo que todavía está frente precisamente de esta maestría. Entonces tiene un gran número de publicaciones y sus intereses están alrededor de todo lo que son las áreas de la geomática. Pues ya tenemos 10 años. De hecho, cuando vino la primera vez no hablaba mucho español, inglés sí, claro, pero español decía gracias, hola y hasta ahí, ¿no? Pero actualmente ya podemos platicar hasta en español con él. Afortunadamente, pues yo le hablo en inglés, él me habla en español y así practicamos los dos desde siempre. Entonces, es un gran amigo, es una gran persona y pues más allá de ser un gran investigador, creo que siempre nos deja un buen sabor de boca sus presentaciones. Bueno, sin más, le dejo la palabra al doctor Neil Stewart. Gracias, Neil, por estar aquí.
Y gracias, Marco. Hola a todos. Marco ha dicho mi español no es bueno, por esta razón voy a hablar en inglés, pero lento y con muchas imágenes, si es mejor. So, voy a presentar es un charla para el beneficio de los estudiantes de la Applied Geography. Para el ejemplo, yo voy a discutir es sobre un proyecto que Dolores y otros amigos aquí en la Universidad de UNAM conocen muy bien, sobre los riesgos de desastres en Guatemala. So, es un tema realístico por los chicos aquí. También voy a discutir los otros beneficios del programa de Applied Geography y las posibilidades por trabajar juntos en la futura. Ok, suficiente en español. Es un poquito de introducción a la Universidad de Edimburgo y especialmente mi escuela, que se llama la Escuela de Geociencias. entonces es la Escuela de Geociencias. Mi charla por este día, el nombre es Thoughts on Map-Making Practices for Disaster Risk Reduction. So I'd like to share some experiences of working in an proyecto interdisciplinario, an interdisciplinary project. As a geographer, I am a physical geographer, and I'd like to share some reflections which I hope could be useful for the students of applied geography about how we work together in interdisciplinary teams. So just a little bit sobre mío, quién, who am I? So I'm a physical geographer. I've been a director of a master's program in HIS y Earth Observation for muchos años, and I also work for enhancing teaching quality and as a director of international relations for Edinburgh University. And perhaps more interestingly, you can see that, as Marco explained, I feel very much like I come back home when I visit you here in El Instituto. Gracias por estas oportunidades sobre los años, over the years. I've been very delighted to visit here, to give courses. For example, in the picture here, we have students, ex-alumnus, taking a course on geographical information systems, spatial analysis, and bases de datos. And that was a great course. We can see Anna here from your program. And you can see that I've also collaborated on lots of other topics. This was one I enjoyed recently, sobre las cuencas de los ríos de Morelia in Michoacán, looking at the pressures on the water resources in Michoacán. So I think some of you know about Edinburgh. Bienvenido a Edinburgh. You're very welcome if you have an opportunity to come to Scotland. Right now is a good time because it's nice and warm. Perhaps it's demasiado calor aquí, so perhaps consider coming to Scotland. You're very welcome. I was delighted to welcome Marco to Edinburgh last year, and through the projects that we work on, we very much like to try to have the investigators come to Edinburgh. So 2 weeks ago, we had our investigadores from the Proyecto in Guatemala visitors in Edinburgh, and I think it was a really good operation, a really good opportunity. So a little bit about Edinburgh. Yes, paisaje hermosa, very beautiful. It's also one of the largest geosciences schools in the UK. So we have geofísica, geologistas, geógrafos, ecologistas. So we have many different disciplines working together in geography and geosciences. And I think that's a really good opportunity for us to work together. And so for the benefit of the students who may join online or may watch the presentation later, I tried to put together a few thoughts today for those students who are doing Aplicados de Geografía, Applied Geography, at one of the most influential universities here in Latin America. And thinking about what are the things which I try to teach my students beyond just the technical areas which they need in GIS. What are the other additional skills and experiences that we try now to give our students so they can work together in these interdisciplinary projects and really confront some of those global challenges that we saw in the video. So when we talk about applied geography, sometimes we think about that as technology being applied for a particular purpose. And over the years, I think GIS has been one of the most successful areas where geography has been applied to el mundo real, to the real world. First of all, with bases de datos, imágenes de satélites, modelos de terreno, and then con drones, y in la futura, the cloud or Nuebole, and new applications in Inteligencia Artificial. So it's true to say that our subject is partly driven by technology, and we need our students to be able to use technology. Everybody on your program, I'm sure, knows how to use GPS to collect data, and we all know how ubiquitous imagery is now, and that is a big change from when I was a student. It was very difficult to get satellite imagery in those days. What I say to my students is that when they come to do our programs, they tend to concentrate on the technical areas. They tend to ask me, do you have a course on spatial analysis? Do you have a course on Earth observation? Do you have a course on three-dimensional mapping, for example? What we try to do in the course is give them these technical skills, of course, but also help them to move in this diagram to the other side of the diagram, where you start applying the technology and using it in the real-world contexts. And that means our students need to know also about things like open data, different sources of data. They need to evaluate quality of data. And they also need to be aware of the bigger world outside of GIS. So they need to understand words like business intelligence or digital data engineering, big data, for example. They need to understand about how to take one set of analysis that they have done for their project and replicate it many times, or replicate it for another year, or replicate it in a different place. In other words, how do we scale up from the small proof of concept to the operational applications? Well, GIS, as you know, right, it's everywhere. It's somewhat ubiquitous these days. It's being applied all around the world in many disciplines, professions, and organizations. So GIS isn't anymore the property of geography departments, right? It's for everybody, which is good. But we also have to think about what are the things, how do we add value, how do we use GIS as part of our geographical investigations? So I think we have a very particular way in which we use GIS, which is as a research method and not just simply as a way of implementing something. What I mean is that we apply a geographical approach. We conduct investigations. And for us, GIS is just one tool of many tools which we use. And in this diagram, I'm trying to represent that whole process of collecting data, analyzing the data, visualizing it, and then, importantly, acting on it, making decisions on it. And that might include the decision to go back and do it again, or go back and do it better. So it's important, I think, to understand the technology, but then to see its place as a way of investigating things. Recently, this field that Marco and I talk about, we call it geomatics. It's a field that's constantly growing with new technology. And recently, this international organization identified a series of areas where they believe there are big opportunities to make changes and to have impact in society. So I think it's important for our students to know which areas these are, because they might want to specialize in them. In the talk today, I'm just going to mention three areas, the last three, which are about open data and contributed or volunteered data. This idea that we have to sometimes blend official data with locally contributed data. And that's a kind of theme through the rest of today's presentation. We also have to think about effective presentations of that data, how to present the data in a meaningful way. And I think that's really important in this context of disaster risk reduction. And the third point I'm going to make is don't underestimate the importance of telling stories. Really, as a teacher these days, a lot of the time, that's what I do. I'm telling stories, supported by data, but my students usually tell me, "Oh, I forgot all the information in your lecture, except for that story which you told. That story was very good." And that's the part that they remember. So let's think a little bit about how we tell stories, not just about ourselves, but about other people. So this topic of volunteer geographic information, it's very popular at the moment. It's a great idea. We can all collect information. We all have something to contribute. For the GIS people, we have to think about how we combine that information with existing authoritative information. So this is an area which I think is really important, especially in areas where, for example, maps can be old or out of date. Things change. And usually local people know very well about what is really happening. So we need to think of ways of collecting that information. So the title of the talk today was to reflect on these ideas in the context of a particular project. And in Geosciences in Edinburgh, we've been very pleased to work on lots of different projects in different areas. But one area which has been really important for us recently is the areas of reducing the risk from disasters. And those could be from earthquakes, from terremotos, from tsunamis, inundaciones, y también volcanes. Okay? And in Mexico, well, perhaps you don't have tsunamis, but you have most of the other risks, right? You have most of these hazards. So I think the information is important for Mexico. This is, if you work with disaster risk, you often see a diagram like this. It's a cycle. And the cycle takes us from the time when the disaster happens. It's como un reloj. It's like a watch. It's like a clock. It takes us from the time the disaster happens, the immediate needs for information immediately after a disaster, and then over time, we go round the circle and we start to think about how we prepare people, how we plan to try to make things better next time. It's this idea of making improvements and making changes. So is there a role for map making in this process? Is there a role for geographic information in this process? I hope so. And I'd like to suggest to you that in the same way that our colleagues work to improve monitoring, work to improve communications, from our side, we need to think about how we work to improve the maps that we make. What different kinds of maps do we need at different stages in this cycle? How about a map straight after an eruption? How about a map 6 months after an eruption? How about a map that's going to produce, for example, a new land use plan or a new zoning to try to make the areas safer for the future, or an evacuation plan? So lots of ways in which I think maps can fit into this process. Now, nowadays, we don't have very many specialist cartographers, but what we do have is lots of people who want to make maps for lots of different reasons. So what I want us to think about today is a few of these preguntas. How might we make our maps differently? What are we doing right now? Are those representations adequate? Or do we want to think about how we can go beyond sometimes traditional map making and be brave? Maybe include some things which you wouldn't consider normally as part of a map. But they might be really important bits of information that we should be trying to include. Remember that when we read a map, it places a kind of pressure on our brains. There's a kind of load when we try to interpret a map. And in situations when we need people to understand and respond quickly, we want to make that process as easy as possible. So questions like, can we include more relevant local information? Do we still need all those conventions from traditional map making? Or is it still important to think about which way is north or which colour to show things with? Which way shall we orient the map? What scale of map do we need? So I'd like to suggest that we still need to think about those things, but we can think also more flexibly about the form and the presentation of the information. And the philosophical bit of the talk today is when I reflect about how I also have changed the ways that I work, changed the ways which I make maps nowadays, after working in these situations, particularly in Central America, over the last 20 years or so, and interacting with people, and realizing there's a lot more to making maps than just the actual final map. So I want to talk a little bit about, let us reflect a little bit about the process itself. When we are making maps, what else can we be understanding? What else can we be listening to, as well as following the technical approach of actually making the map? Okay, so I hope that's not too many questions. I probably can't answer all of them today, but I think we should think about them. So when we make maps, we have to think about our audience, audiencias. And obviously, in the context of making maps about hazards, natural hazards, one of the main producers of those maps are the institutions. For example, organizations, universities, national map agencies like INEGI are all involved in that process of producing what we call authoritative mapping. That means the maps that we trust, the maps which the government endorses. So it's important to understand those basic maps, because those base maps can be really important for giving a map authority. But also, we know that maps in GIS, we can have lots of layers, right? GIS, one of my students once said, GIS is like a hamburger. I said, okay. Because they said, well, it's lots of different layers. You can have it con queso, sin queso, con tomato, sin tomato. Effectively, we can layer, we can take layers in and out, and we can create the map that contains just the information we want, just in the way that you can choose different fillings for a sandwich. So in the context of preparing maps for disaster situations, we have to think ahead. We have to think ahead about the layers that we want to include. And sometimes our maps, even though they contain really useful scientific information, they might be difficult to understand, or they might contain information which means that they are less useful than we want them to be. I've had several examples where I've brought some really useful scientific information, I've put it on a map, and I've given it to local communities. And before I get to explain about the science and everything in the map, somebody will say, my village is not on your map, or the name of my village is wrong, it's an error. And little things like that can really change the confidence that people have in the maps that we make. So although we're very interested, for example, in this case, to put our really important scientific information in the map, we mustn't forget that the detail, the context is also super important. And actually, if we work with local people to check that context, check that that information is useful for them, maybe the whole map is more useful. So one of the things that we do now much more regularly than we used to do is asking local people, showing people draft versions of the maps and including local knowledge into the mapping. So examples, for example, here we have a group of ladies in the Región de Atitlán in Guatemala. It's in the Guatemalan highlands, in the Cordillera. And what we're asking them to do is to label features. Okay, so you might say, well, why do that? We have a nice label button in ArcGIS. We can label the features very easily. But it's important that the features mean something to people, that they are the places which they know, the places which they recognize. And those might not be, for example, the same features that we have labeled, for example, on OpenStreetMap or something like this. So collecting this local knowledge and making the map more relevant is, I think, a really important way that we can supplement the base map with important local information. In many cases, a certain event has a big consequence for the things we do. Okay, that sounds like life, doesn't it? That one day, something big happens and it changes the way that we do things. In the context of mapping volcanic risk, that day might have been June 2018 and the eruption of Volcán de Fuego in Guatemala. Because it was the first time that we really used digital mapping effectively, I think, to convey to big audiences what had happened. This picture from Getty Images went around the world shortly after this event, which for the non-volcanologists in the audience is known as a flujo pyroclastico, see? So it's a very hot, very fast-moving flow of material coming down from the crater in the volcano, and it can come down at perhaps speeds of, say, 100 kilometers an hour. So very fast, it can come all the way down here in just a few minutes. You know, to sort of give you context, that's like even faster than the taxis go on the Periférico. Super fast. But what it means is that people don't have much time to react. People don't have time to evacuate sometimes. And so planning and preparing for these events and understanding the risks is really important. So being able to quickly communicate information about what has happened, and then if we're trying to provide assistance into these areas, we need ways of quickly sharing the basic information. Now, those of you who work in Earth observation, you will know that some systems exist for immediately responding to hazards. This is an example. This is the Copernicus Rapid Mapping System. It was developed by the European Union, and its whole purpose is to quickly respond when there's a disaster. So it has a template, the layout, the legend, everything is ready-made, the base information is already made, and what we do is we simply insert a satellite image into there and create a map like this. And if we look at the map, you can see that this is the area. It's great technical information, but if we give this immediately to a disaster response agency, they will ask us, what do I do with this information? They will ask us for really much more simpler information. And also looking at this in 2 dimensions, it has quite a load on your brain to think about this. Compare it then with this image, which is the same event, but it's being produced for the general public. It's from the New York Times. It shows us the context. It shows us how high is this volcano, how steep are the slopes, how many of these little pueblitos people live very close to the volcano in dangerous places. And by looking at a picture like this, I think it's much lower cognitive load. We can very quickly understand what happened, which villages were affected, and where the zones of risk are. And we can zoom in with our satellite imagery, and we can look at different villages which have been affected in different ways. And of course, those of you who know the story know that some villages had time to evacuate and some did not. So this village, which is a well-connected, it has good communications, it has a golf course, it has tourists, it has buses, and it has time for people to evacuate. Compare it with the village next door, where many local people lived. In fact, many people who were working at the golf course received the warning, went home quickly to gather their clothes and things, and then the village was devastated by the flujo pyroclastico. So in the days that follow an eruption, we're really trying to filter. We want current information, but we need it quickly. And we need simple messages that tell people things like, ¿Este puente es abierto o no? Is this road, is this bridge, can we actually use this way of traveling, yes or no? And that's why I found it really helpful to work together with charities, with organizations that specialize in producing information rapidly in disaster situations. So I just mentioned to you this organization. Some of you may know it already. It's called Map Action. It's a humanitarian mapping charity. So they make maps, they go to dangerous places, and they make maps quickly to help the disaster relief operations. So they use the maps to give people just the information they need to target and coordinate humanitarian aid. They're voluntarios. It's a volunteer charity organization, and many of my ex-alumnus who work for many different companies will work part-time. When there's an emergency, they will leave their company, they will work for 1, 2, 3 weeks with Map Action to produce the maps they need. Right now I have 3 of my ex-alumnus working on a map of the Fuegos Forestales in Belize, for example. So a good question in the case of the Fuego volcano was there no map already? And of course, quite often the answer is yes, there was a map, but it wasn't a map in the right form, or it wasn't a map that was accessible quickly to give the information needed. So in fact, the USGS had made a hazard map of this area primarily to look at the risks from mud flows in hurricanes. But actually, a lot of the areas which they identified in these barrancas, high-risk areas, are also areas that are at risk from flujos pyroclasticos. One of the projects which was conducted at Edinburgh, just a few days after the eruption and the flow, was to take the existing hazard data, what we knew about the hazards, and try to make that information much more widely available. So here we can see mapping that was done by my colleague Eliza Calder, volcanologist in Edinburgh, and also tambien with colleagues at Michigan Tech, and with the local geology institutes in Guatemala, to very quickly make a presentation of where are the risk zones, where is there a very high hazard of more of these events happening. And the final step, which I think was really important, was to make a map like this accessible so that many people could access it. And Map Action took the map and, using ArcPro, for those of you who know a little bit about GIS, and ArcGIS Online, made an interactive version of the map. So this is a map that can be on a web page, a Página de Web, and organizations can access this information quickly. They can see where are the flows, which areas are in the danger zones, which are the settlements, what are the names of those settlements, and how close to the danger zones are those places located. And this map, which was the first of its kind to be created, was used more than 50,000 times in 4 weeks. So that, to me, shows it's giving useful information to, for example, Cruz Rojo, that's Organizaciones por Protección Civil, lots of different organizations who all come into this situation and they very quickly need to know, ¿qué pasa? ¿Dónde son los problemas? ¿Dónde son las áreas de riesgos? Etc. So since we collaborated on that particular event, that was the event that made us all come together, we've been thinking more about how we make these maps more effective. And by talking to institutions around the world, we've made a collection of these online maps. And if you want to look at them, you can search and take a look at this. You can look at maps. We have maps for volcanoes in many different parts of the world. And sharing that information, the organizations realized, finally, we've made these maps, but now people can actually see them. So it's called the University of Edinburgh and Map Action Volcanic Mapping Project. I wanted to touch a little bit more on the non-technology part. Okay, this is a little bit sort of technology, right? It's online mapping, and it's useful. But in the process of doing those maps, in the process of working with those communities, what I've learned is that those communities have got lots of useful information that they want to share, and they've got lots of information which we can help them to share, but it also can be useful for us as the map makers because they're telling us things about what's important for them, which features are the features which they would like to see on the maps. So it's como un dialogue of knowledge, un diálogo de conociencias. Here's one example where we collect local information, but we do it in a way that's shared with the community. So it's a little bit extractive, but it's also something that we're sharing with the communities. So we work with the communities and we walk with the communities and we collect the information. So here's an example from, this is the area of Atitlan, for those of you who know Guatemala. Many of you may have visited here. So in each of these areas, we go and we collect information. We're using technologies like GPS, satellite imagery, but we're combining it with information from local people. So what people are saying as they're walking, what people are telling us, we're recording that information, we're transcribing that information, and importantly, we're giving it a context, we're giving it a location. So these are what I call living landscapes. It's basically putting a layer into our system which tells us about how people use this landscape. See, son paisajes viviendas, are their living areas. And I find this more positive than just thinking about risks or vulnerabilities. We understand that these areas have risk. We know that the people are vulnerable. But what the people want to tell us is that we want to be here, we have reasons to be here, and we want to carry on our lives here in spite of the risks. So for me, we think a lot of the time about going to the ground as a way to find out the truth about places. I'm sure you all remember this idea of ground truth, which is check your satellite imagery on the ground. I think we can actually incorporate some other kinds of information, some other truths as well. So in this case, I'm talking about social information or social ground truth. And what kind of things could this be? Okay, this is not just GPS coordinates, this is not waypoints. This is information, this is narratives, this is stories about how people live in these places, about why people do live there, how they move in the landscape, if they've been displaced from one place to another, if they're trying to reclaim areas of landscape. For example, when we have time to listen, and we're not just collecting our GPS data and going, we hear about the stories. We hear the stories of family displacements, about people who are forced to move and relocate. We hear stories about the Lineadores who lose access to the forests and can't collect the wood that is their livelihood. So we understand much more about the way in which people are using their landscapes. And of course, this is not sort of information that we would have traditionally collected. And finally, map making is a two-way process, right? It shouldn't just be about how we make better maps. It should be a process also about what people would like to see in the maps. And we have an area of research, it's called counter mapping, whereby communities tell us things about what's important to them. So here's an example of when people make maps or use maps in different ways for different purposes that we'd never intended. So in one case on the left, a family describing a very difficult circumstance when their village was affected by a mud flow. And the map, they picked up the map and they used the map to locate themselves, to say this was our village, this was our street, this was my house, and this is what happened. So they're using the map to make their own narrative, their own story. On the right, a group of villagers telling us this is what happens to us when the authorities create a red zone, when the authorities say you cannot live here because it's Peligroso. And these are the real consequences of that. We don't have water. We don't have electricity. Life is already hard, and then it becomes even harder. So this is feedback, this is retroalimentación. It's telling us about the consequences and the ways that our maps are being used. And I have a student this year, some of you know a product called Story Maps, and it's a way of telling stories using maps. And we're actually using it to gather some of these stories that people want to tell us about living in these landscapes, living with these hazards, and bringing their stories down and putting them on the ground. So to complete the example, I think that actually maps can be super useful in lots of different parts of this cycle, from the immediately after the event all the way through to planning and preparing people for the next event and thinking about how we incorporate how they want to live, how they want to stay in the areas as part of understanding the hazards that are there. I think I said that doing that process, working through that process, it affects us, right? It affects all of us. And for me, my journey as a GIS professional has changed a lot. You know, I started off, that's me too many years ago. You can see by the computer how old that is. Making maps the conventional way, gathering the basic information, taking the satellite image, going to the ground with my GPS, finishing the map, that was it. And nowadays I'm realizing that's only the beginning, right? We have to then take those maps, we have to use them, we have to influence things with those maps. So there I am talking to people who actually live in that village, in that neighborhood, and you taking time to listen to people has been really important, I think, for me, in making better maps. And thinking about the skills for our students, I was looking at this is a way of, like, we can all do this. We can all look at our skills and see if we are focused, if we are specialized, or if we are generalists. And even for geographers who sometimes think that they're quite general, it's a useful thing to do because we realize we're actually still, we're very focused. For example, I was very focused on science and technology. I thought that was the skills I learned at university. That's what I thought I would always do. And from doing these projects in the real world, you realize the importance of these other skills as well. The little blue bit up there was languages, because I could hardly speak any Spanish, and yet I was working in Central America. So, and other things are like being open to other forms. The yellow is music and art and other things which maybe you think of as your personal things, but not something that you use in terms of doing your day-to-day work. But actually appreciating music, appreciating art, understanding how people use murales, for example. The more we're open to understanding all these forms of communication, I think the way we can start to design better information products. So science and technology is helpful. GPS, satellite images, they offer us global standards, but also we have to think about other parts, other contributions to the maps. I've talked about local knowledge. I've talked about ways of balancing authoritative maps with local information. It's a kind of balance of power, if you think about it, to try to make it a bit more level. And in many of the maps that we make, we try to show the message even if you don't understand the language. So if the map can work for a person who speaks English, a person who speaks Spanish, a person who speaks Sotujil Maya, that's a really good map. I just wanted to take the last couple of minutes just to sort of make a couple of comments about this broader skills. I think I've tried to show you here that we are evolving the way that we make maps in disaster risk situations. But for the students who are watching, or the students who will watch this presentation later, I just wanted to say a couple of things about how my own students are developing their skills beyond the science and technology. My students are always asking me, can I get a job with GIS? And the answer is usually almost always yes. Our students get jobs before they finish their program, and probably the same for Marco here. But the nature of those jobs is quite different now. And my message to the students is, don't limit yourself. Don't only look for jobs in, say, we need a experto de bases de datos, or we need an expert with QGIS, or we need an expert with ArcGIS. Because there's many other jobs beyond these specialist jobs here, which are considered the conventional GIS job areas. If I look at the master's programs that I have in Edinburgh in geosciences, the courses that Mexican students come to Edinburgh and do, it's not just the technical skills that they're asking for. We have programs in GIS, we have programs in Earth observation, but look how many other programs we have. And actually programs in areas like energy, environmental sustainability, and understanding how we balance environment and development. These are programs which a lot of Mexican students come to do, even if their original background was in a technical area. They're wanting to open their skill set, broaden beyond the individual discipline that they were doing. And I guess it's always nice to end a talk with some good news. My good news message at the moment is that there's lots of jobs. There's going to be lots of jobs in the future in GIS. This is just some results of recent surveys telling us, look how much growth we can expect in geographic information systems in the markets. And a lot of that growth is coming not only in the conventional areas like North America, but also in Latin America. A recent report there is predicting at least 10% growth in the GIS sector in Latin America, which I think is really good news. And the top 3 countries, I thought I'd just share this slide with you, because what they say, I think a lot of people said, oh, probably Brazil. And some people said, oh, well, probably Chile. But actually, the number 1 country predicted for growth in GIS in Latin America, it's right here, it's Mexico. Okay, so I think that's plenty from me. I hope you found a little bit of that information useful. And if we have time for a few questions, I'd be very happy to take them. Gracias.
alguna pregunta? Sí. En español no hay problema. Sí, sí es necesario, sí, pero...
Muy interesante, muchas gracias. En el caso de de la cartografía social, al trabajar en comunidades, que nosotros no sabemos maya y pues menos usted, ¿no? Pero en el contacto, en la comunicación, porque no necesariamente los indígenas van a hablar inglés, a lo mejor sí, no lo sé, pero cómo se logra esa comunicación, siempre tiene contacto con los locales que pueden ser intérpretes y ayudar a interpretar y reconocer los lugares o espacios que los habitantes de esos lugares donde están atendiendo pueden lograr llegar a esa cartografía social y después ya la interpretación y la charla con la comunidad, qué tan fácil o difícil ha podido ser, sobre todo con este problema tan concreto.
Buena pregunta, ¿no? Yeah, I think you're right. If I understood correctly, what I'm showing in that example from Guatemala is really an ideal situation. It's a situation where we've been working with those communities for more than 3 years. And that means that we have time to build up relation, we have time to build up trust with those communities so that they're more willing to share that information with us. And even in those cases, I think it's important to explain, and particularly for the students to know, that this idea of community is a difficult idea, right? No es solo una comunidad, right? Hay muchas comunidades en el dentro. And everybody will have a motivation, everybody will have a reason what they want to say with the maps. So I think it's really, if this is what you were helping us to explore, I think it's a really important point in that although we talk about rebalancing power, in some ways there are limitations to what we can do. I think it's very important as scientists that we're still truthful to the science, that we still say, for example, this is a dangerous place, you know. So it's important to try to express the other point of view, but I think we also have to try to find a balance that we feel is truthful in terms of explaining this is what the communities feel about the place, this is what we feel about the risks in this place. And for me, that's a conversation then. That's using our information to make a conversation so that at least both sides of this can be expressed. Does that answer the question a little bit? Gracias.
Muchas gracias. Gracias por su presentación. Bueno, mi pregunta va en un sentido parecido. Una vez que van a las comunidades y absorben esa información y hay un intercambio de conocimiento, desde su experiencia y sus metodologías, ¿cuál es el siguiente paso a ese? Y en general, hay otras metodologías, ¿no? Por ejemplo, las japonesas en donde van y viven mucho tiempo ahí, conocen a la gente, hacen confianza, etcétera. Pero desde esta perspectiva, ¿qué pasa después de ir? Es decir, hay una retroalimentación mutua, hay conciencia de que existe el riesgo, pero ¿qué hacen con los datos después de eso, tanto ustedes como ellos? ¿Y cuál ha sido la fase siguiente a ese paso? Gracias.
Okay, another great question. So if I understand, you're helping us to think about really what happens after we go through that process of collecting that information. And And I've been trying to think for a while about what we give back to people. Because every time that we go to a place and we ask people to give us information and we ask people about Lugares Consignifica, it takes time from them to give us this information. So I think we do have an obligation, if we're working with communities like this, that we ask them, what can we help to make for you? For example, one of the products that we're thinking of making with the story map is considered a very useful way of collecting lots of different information, narratives, pictures, video, etc. Information desde abuelas, por ejemplo. And in one example, the community asked us, they said, we'd like to contribute information about lugares spirituosos, spiritual places. And we had to think very carefully about who we share that information with, because there are examples in other parts of the world where when we put information on a map, it becomes much more accessible. So there's a responsibility with that in terms of who can see that information and also who will use the information and for what purpose. And as map makers, what we have to realize is that we cannot control how the information is going to be used after it's shared. So that's a super challenging question for us, is that, can we decide that some information won't be made available online, for example? There's one example where we will create a story map. We'll think of a way that the information can be used by communities that don't have internet access. And then we'll think of a way of creating it in a physical format, like a book, if it contains information that's private to the community. But we're still at the beginning of that process of thinking about the life of the data after the projects that we do.
Thank you. First of all, I'm going to say my question in English. Well, I was wondering, in terms of risk reduction, how can, in your personal experience, how do you think we can bridge this gap between the information that is given through the maps and the policy making? Because at the end of the day, for example, the red zone that you mentioned in your example was a policy decision. So how can, with our information given through the maps, how can we bridge that gap? That is my question. Thank you.
That's a great question. So I'll tell you, in our experience, one example of how we're trying to bridge that gap. Because the final step needs to be, well, with this extra information, how does that help? So, very specific example, one of the villages that we're working with, the villagers, the community, what they really want us to do is to make a new map which says this area should not be a red zone, because we want our electricity, we want water, we want the school back open, we want El Centro de Salud. Of course, they want all those things. When we are assessing the risk, the reality is that that village is in a risky place. But it's no more risky than lots of other villages nearby. The only difference really is that an event happened in that location and it did not happen in these other villages. And so the problem there, as you say, is the policy. And it's a sort of a little bit of a misunderstanding, I think, about risk. There's lots of places that are risky. There's lots of places where we should recognize risk. But I think a policy which looks at places where disasters happened, where people already suffered so much, and then additionally imposes these extra restrictions on them is not a helpful policy. So we're in a process of talking to the civil protection agencies, talking about that. And instead of, in that example, instead of making a more detailed map, one possibility they asked us is, can you make us a microzonation of this area and show us like this area here is not so risky, or this area over here may be okay. We also wanted to show a map to the authorities which said, this is just one of 200 villages where that risk could happen. So, so the question you ask about how you influence policies, the best we can do, I think, as scientists at the moment, is we can convene meetings at which the point of view of the community is presented. We also present the scientific information about the risks. And it's an understanding is needed from both sides. The communities need to understand why there is a risk there, and the organizations need to think, could there be a better way? Could there be a way of actually helping these communities rather than just creating red zones?
Bueno, okay.
Gracias, Neil. Thank you very much. I want to ask about how to make maps more comprehensible without our intervention, because most of the times, at least in some part of the academia, when we make maps, we don't have the possibility to follow the processes to bring maps to communities or to the final users. And then, well, I'm agree about the thing of 3D possibility to show the hazard areas or risk areas or some specifics of the communities, but how to make maps more comprehensible without us.
Yeah.
Autonomous.
It's a great question, Dolores, isn't it? And it's one that I think about a lot, because one of the things that we can't go everywhere, and in response to the question before about it's difficult to work with communities. It takes time to work with communities. It takes time to build up that trust. So if you don't have all those surrounding processes, how do we then communicate that information? I guess for me, my thoughts there are that we need to actually build up the knowledge, the understanding of those products with, for example, the ONGs, with, for example, the organizations that need to interpret that information and then make those shorter-term decisions. So I think it's particularly problematic when it's a very short-term decision. People need to read a map very quickly and then make an action. Maybe it's slightly easier to think about it in the context of disaster preparedness, where the communities have got more time, the organizations have got time to have a dialogue with them to say, these are the risks, this is what we understand you're doing now, how you're living now, what you're doing in these areas. And that might be a basis for a dialogue where they can think about how to maybe modify, or what are the limitations on modifying land use in certain areas. It's not easy, because we know that we can make lots of planificaciones, we can make lots of land use plans, but if they're not enforced, then it's not going to affect the ways that people are living, and it's not going to have that reduction of risk that we're trying to anticipate. I guess it's because we're just part of that process, but maybe we don't think so much about how that information is being used, what needs to go with the information, what needs to go with the map, so that people can extract the right information. I think in the end, working with the local organizations, helping them to translate the technical map into other kinds of information might just be as simple as an evacuation route. You know, develop 3 possible evacuation routes, test them, work with the communities to see which are most acceptable. Something like this.
Bueno, rápidamente de redes sociales tenemos 2 comentarios y una pregunta. Miguel Ángel Mancilla Estanciola, felicitaciones por el ponente. Escuchar al mapa es aplicar la perspectiva. Saludos desde la Sierra Madre Occidental, Michoacana. Todo el estudio cartográfico dirigido a la interpretación social. Jesse Jim, gracias. Muy interesante la ponencia y el externar la importancia de la cartografía y plasmar la manera en que las personas habitan su entorno. Y por último, Norma López Castillo ask about which are the main reasons why people decide not participate in this kind of projects.
That's a great question. Gracias por eso. So, the whole question about how we gather local information. So there are many attempts in different countries to gather information from communities or from residentes or from people who are living in an area. In the case of the Rios de Morelia project, just as an example, there was a project to create a platform so that people could share information about local inundaciones. And we expected that there would be a lot of interest in the project. We thought the constraint would be that a lot of people who are living in these areas, obviously, they are quite poor. And we thought the constraint might be that they wouldn't have the technology, they wouldn't have mobile phones to contribute the information, or they wouldn't want to use credit on their phones to give information. In fact, people were very happy to do that. They told us it's not a technological barrier. The reason we don't want to give this information, it goes directly to the questions we had before, was because they didn't trust how the information would be used. They said, will the local authority see this information? And to us, we thought that would be a good thing, because it would point out the areas where people are suffering inundation. But actually, they said, we don't want to share this information because we don't want to be identified individually. We don't want to be identified in terms of where people are living, because we fear the authorities will use that information in a different way. So I think understanding, it goes to the question about when we make maps or we gather information, who will use it additionally? Who will use it as well as us? We might have a buen proposa, but if people are worried that there's another motivation, another use for that geographical information that might not be good for them, of course, why will we share that information?
Bueno, si no hay ninguna otra pregunta, le damos las gracias al doctor Neil y también les damos gracias a los presentes por asistir y los que están en línea. Muchísimas gracias.